Okay, well, welcome back to World History. Today's lesson is going to be 32.2a, Japan's Pacific Campaign, Part 1. Um, as a recap of where we've been, in the last week or over the course of the last week, we saw the start of World War II, at least the start of World War II in Europe. Those of you who may know already from, again, movies, video games, stories that you hear from family, you'll know that World War II isn't just in Europe. World War II is also going to be fought in Asia and the Pacific. We're going to be seeing that today. Well, anyways, last week we saw the start of World War II in Europe when Germany invaded Poland. We saw how Germany invaded much of Europe, North Africa, and is part of Eastern Europe called the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. And we also saw how Great Britain signed the Atlantic Charter, which was this agreement that they both agreed that the best type of government was one where people get to choose their leadership. In other words, a democracy with the United States, even though the US was still officially neutral. Now, remember, at no point in the last week did the US actually declare war on anyone. The US has been neutral, which means not taking sides. Today, we are going to see how the United States really does get involved and does eventually take a side in World War II. Um, by the end of today, then, as I mentioned, our focus is going to be on the Pacific, namely in our battle, in our war against Japan or Imperial Japan. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to tell me why Japan decides to attack the United States. It's kind of a mystery, right? Like Japan is a tiny little country versus a giant country like the US. You'll understand, hopefully, some of that reasoning by the end of this lesson. And number two, you should understand how Japan continued to extend its empire into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. So let's take a look at the first of these two objectives for today, Japan's attack on the United States. A little bit of background, a little bit of review. You may remember from previous weeks that in the 1930s, Japan invaded China. However, this is important, China is a huge country. And even though Japan is able to invade parts of China, most of China remains outside of Japan's control. So the Chinese resistance is going to keep dragging on and on and on. It is taking much longer than the Japanese thought. Now, the problem with the war, if it's going on for too long, is that eventually you start running out of resources. And that's what ends up happening with Japan. So to continue supporting their campaign in China, Japan is going to need more natural resources, including oil. Japan wants to get these resources from other parts of Asia. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of European countries had already taken a lot of parts of Asia. So Japan's plan is going to have to be to take resources from the parts of Asia already colonized by the European powers and by the United States. Meaning, if you're following this line of reasoning, meaning they're going to have to get in a fight with these European countries. They're going to have to eventually get in a fight with the US. So that's what's happening on one level. On the other level, American leadership is watching this, and they're watching World War II happening in Europe. Now they're seeing what's happening in Asia, and they're realizing, you know what, if we let Japan win in China, and if they conquer territories in Southeast Asia, that's going to threaten our colonies. That's going to threaten the colonies that the United States has in the Philippines. It's going to threaten military bases that the US has in Guam. Not to mention, it'll threaten their allies' bases, Britain and France. Now, to stop the Japanese, then, again, not officially declaring war, not officially taking sides yet, but slow them down, the US starts sending aid to China and stops selling oil to Japan. Now, this to Japan is it's a pressure. Now they have to decide, what are we going to do about the US and Asia? What are we going to do to make sure that we can get to these colonies down here so that we can take their natural resources to send them back to Japan so that we can keep fighting in China? Now, Japan or Japanese leadership were not fools. They knew that a tiny little country versus a big country like the US over here, they would not win if it was a long war. Japan knew that they would likely lose in a long war against the US, China, and the European empires in Asia. They know that. That's not their plan. Japan's plan is to launch a surprise attack then. They hoped that a sudden, devastating attack would force the US and its allies to negotiate instead of triggering a war. Now, why do I have Hawaii circled over here? Well, it's important to know that there is a big base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you've heard of it in the context of World War II. Maybe you know Japan attacks it. Maybe you know where this story is going. Now, Japan's plan. Why are they so focused on Hawaii? Well, that's where the U.S., the United States, has its Pacific Fleet. That's where the United States Navy, based in the Pacific, has its biggest base. Had its biggest base there. It's in San Diego now, but back then it was in Hawaii. Now, the Japanese realized if the US is keeping most of its ships, most of its planes here, if they attack this little base, not little, but if they attack this one base, and they are so successful that they destroy so many ships and so many airplanes, they know the US isn't going to be ready to strike back right away. They know the US may want to negotiate, at least at first. And that's Japan's vision, is at least buy enough time to be able to get whatever resources they want to steal from here to take it back to Japan to continue fighting in China. That's their vision, right? It's not necessarily want a war with the US. They just want to get it out of the way long enough so they can do what they want in Asia. December 7th, 1941, the day of infamy. This is the day of the surprise attack. Americans knew Japan was planning a surprise attack. We had broken the Japanese code. We were constantly hearing back and forth between Japanese airplanes and Japanese ships. They were planning something. They just didn't know where. On the morning of December 7th, we found out where. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Americans in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, awoke to the sound of Japanese bomber planes. 2,300 Americans were killed in this attack. Japan basically accomplished its goal of landing a devastating surprise attack on the US. Roosevelt, remember the president of the United States at this time is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt addresses stunned Americans on the radio, famously calling it a day which will live in infamy. You'll learn more about that in US history next year. It's also important in world history to understand that at almost exactly the same time, like to the minute, Japanese forces also attacked. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor. It wasn't just the US that was attacked, but they attacked the British colony of Hong Kong, and they also launched an invasion of Thailand. So that's Japan's, again, that's their plan. They are suddenly attacking American and British forces to try to land that devastating blow. Let's do our check for understanding before we continue to see how Japan expands its empire. Again, 3 true and false questions. Number 1, Japan's campaign in China dragged on for much longer than expected. Number 2, Japan wanted to expand their empire into Southeast Asia, but that move would force it into conflict with European colonizers in the US. And number 3, Japan launched a surprise attack against the US in San Diego. All right, at this point, you should have these answered. Let's take a look at our second objective then, where we look at Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. What follows after this is a series of Japanese victories. Again, Japan does accomplish its goal of stunning the United States, of getting us off our guard, which means Japan is able to do what it wants, which is expand, cutting ahead there, which means expanding in Asia. Japanese forces conquer much of Southeast Asia. They conquered British colonies in Southeast Asia, including Hong Kong, Singapore, Malay. There were American colonies in Asia and the Pacific, like the Philippines, Guam, which is this tiny island over here, a really important island because it's a good air base for getting access into Asia, and Wake Island. kind of in between. It's over here in between Hawaii, which is off the map, and Guam. The Japanese also take French colonies, what today we call Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Back then it was called Indochina. And they also took independent Asian states like Thailand. Japan is so successful in this expansion that they even draw up plans. They even get ready to invade India. Okay, that is how successful Japan is in their expansion in Asia. Japanese forces, at least at the beginning, used to say that they were anti-colonialist. When they went into one of these Asian countries, what they would say is, we are liberating you. We are freeing you from the British, the Americans, the French who conquered you. Um, However, the Japanese turned out to be colonizers themselves. The Japanese turned out to be as bad, if not worse, as the people that they supposedly had liberated Asia from. And that's important to know, is that Japanese rule in Asia was extremely brutal. They often treated conquered peoples brutally. You're going to see a picture in the chapter reading where there's even a newspaper headline. It looks like a cheerful newspaper headline. It looks like it's in the sports section or something, and there's like a score, 103 to 105. It wasn't a baseball game. It wasn't a football game. It wasn't basketball. It was a game between two lieutenants who, in an hour, challenged each other to see who could kill more people with a sword. And that's what they were doing for fun. Okay, and it gets much worse. There are so many images. I don't know why they were taking pictures of all this. It's super incriminating. A lot of them, like if you see up here, these are Japanese soldiers being held on trial in the Philippines after World War II for the war crimes that they committed. So you'll see some of that in the chapter reading, but I don't try to put too many pictures because they are really graphic and really disturbing, even for me who's seen this many times. The Japanese also treated their soldiers very brutally. They basically saw surrender as something shameful, as something that made those soldiers no longer worthy of respect. So when they took over those American and British colonies, those American and British soldiers who were captured were treated brutally. The most famous of these, at least in the US, is something called, or the most famous of these atrocities is called the Bataan Death March, where over the course of 50 miles, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. You can do that in 2 or 3 days. Over the course of 50 miles, 70,000 American and British soldiers started the march. And over the course of 50 miles to a prison, only 54,000 survived, which means about 15,000 men died over the course of 50 miles. That is extremely brutal. You hear about things like the Japanese forcing men to dig their own graves and then smacking them on the head with those shovels and then burying them alive. What the Japanese do in Asia, I cannot overstate it, is sadistic. It is as, again, if you are thinking about the things that Nazi Germany is doing in Europe, they do the same thing in Japan, okay? Like the Japanese are doing very similar things. Let's do our second check for understanding. Again, true or false? Japan only wanted to liberate Asian colonies from the European conquerors and treated conquered peoples nicely. And 5, Japanese forces respected captured American and British soldiers. Take a few moments for our check for understanding. All right, just like I did last week, I'm slowing it down a little bit for World War II. We can take our time with it, break it up into smaller pieces. For today, we'll end here. And there's a specific reason why I also just want to end here. We're in the year 1942 in this class. 1942, at least the summer of 1942, is a really dark period in time. Why? Well, if you look at this map, in the black are the countries that are either conquered or controlled by the Nazis or are allied with the Nazis. This includes over here fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. So you can see how much black there is on the map. Now you might say, well, there's a whole lot of blue on this map. In fact, there's more blue than there is black, so things must be going pretty well. The reality is, though, most of this blue is just the British Empire. So realistically, all this blue, like Australia, New Zealand, India, parts of the Middle East, these countries here in South America, on Belize over here used to be a British colony. All these territories, if Britain loses, if this little island gets swallowed up by Nazi Germany, all of this map, almost all the blue turns black. The United States is, of course, entering the war now, so at least Britain has that powerful ally. And then we still have the question in red over here. We haven't really spoken that much about the Soviet Union other than they were defeating the Nazis in Russia. This is a really dark time in world history for all the reasons that I've just mentioned, right? Like, it seems like the Nazis are so close to winning. In fact, they are winning. They seem unstoppable. In the next couple of classes, we are going to see how that tide turns. We're going to see how all this black that keeps expanding starts to get pushed back. It's going to come at a tremendous cost. It's not easy. World War II is the most destructive war in human history. But it is an important story. It's an important story to learn, an important history to learn because of, yes, what happens in World War II, but we're also going to see what happens to reclaim all this black or to push back the Nazis and Imperial Japan really shapes the world in a very profound way that still affects us today. Anyways, that's the end of my spiel. We're about halfway through World War II now. Just as we've been doing at the end of this video lecture, there'll be the chapter reading along with the exit ticket. Now, as I mentioned, we're about halfway now through World War II. If you have any questions, if you don't understand something, don't just, not do the assignments. Email me if you have a question. You also can come to my office hours. Some of you have made good use of that. Some of you have not. Tuesdays and Fridays, 3:15 to 4. You can come see me also Wednesdays from 2 to 2:45. All times when I am available for office hours. Hopefully, I will see some of you then. But until next time, please take care of yourselves, stay safe, and let me know if anything comes up.